Chapter 7. From the Caves to the Locks. When the summer season came, Ignaz left London for a concert tour in Denmark, leaving Felix to stay in London. He had much to do and many to keep company with. Reviews and recaps of the successful concert resided in the newspapers for over a week. Copies of the English papers even reached back home in Berlin. In the midst of the midsummer, he received many letters from his family. There was one that came a bit later than some of the others. It was from Fanny, but it wasn't the most cheerful one. July 8th, 1829. I have finished my contribution to the large family letters to you, dear Felix, and must now add this small, private dispatch, whose contents are as follows. It has come to Father's attention that your name was mentioned merely as Felix Mendelssohn in many English newspapers. He thinks he detects an ulterior motive in this fact, and wants to write to you today about it, as Mother, who tried to dissuade him from doing so, told us yesterday. I do not know if he will still carry it out, but last night, Hensel and I decided to write to you this letter in any case. If it's unnecessary, then it won't hurt you. Possibly it could be of value, and if it's unpleasant, then you will forgive me. I know and approve of your intention to lay aside some day this name that we all dislike, but you can't do it yet because you are a minor, and it's not necessary to make you aware of the unpleasant consequences it could have for you. Suffice to say that you distress Father by your actions. If questioned, you could easily make it look like a mistake, and carry out your plan at a later, more appropriate time. Fanny. Before the summer's end, Felix had the desire to visit Scotland. The idea came to him as he had heard much of the scenery and the inspiration that it could yield. He began planning straight away, writing to Klingmann of the subject. July 1829. My friend of England, I write to you to tell you, next August I am going to Scotland, with a rake for folk leader and an ear for the lovely fragrant countryside, and the heart for the bare legs of natives. Klingmann, you must join me and soar to Scotland. Felix. By the near end of July, Felix packed up for a 2-week trip into the Highlands. He had a desire to see the meadows and the hills, castles of old. He planned to meet the writer Sir Walter Scott at his home of Abbotsford. It would be an adventure-filling experience. Klingmann agreed to accompany Felix. He hoped to get much inspiration for his poetry and writing. After packing as well, he met Felix at one of the streets where they hoped to catch a coach leaving the city. They found one on its way to York. Klingmann knew of a decent inn there. The trip to York was nice, as the carriage they happened upon had no other passengers, making it roomy. The weather fared decent in the 2 days of travel. The inn there was welcoming and offered a good meal. They spent a day and a half in York. Their next departure was set in the afternoon. This time they went by mail coach, which wasn't the most comfortable. They traveled all through the day before making another stop at an inn settled in a country village. It was calm and restful. Felix and Klingmann preyed on a good night's sleep. The mail coach would be taking them to Scotland, leaving early the next day. The morning sun rose, casting light on the dew of the grass and thrushes. They glimmered in such light. The coach was going a more steady pace when Felix and Klingmann awoke from snoozing. The air was calm with a slight chill. They were still tired from departing at the early hour before dawn. The coach was headed for the city of Durham, in which they would arrive that evening. The landscape was now Scotland. Upon making it to the outskirts of the city, they saw beautiful old structures. There were a few old cathedrals that captivated Felix by the looks of them. The coach made a stop as there was a body of water to give the horses a drink. The passengers dispersed the area to take in the sights. Felix grabbed his sketchbook, a gift from Wilhelm, and began penciling the old cathedrals. He then took the watercolors he brought along and painted the drawing. He added texture to the lush leaves and flowing river. Later that evening, upon entering the edge of the city, it was anything but calming. It had begun to rain, and the roads became mud. The coach's wheels rolled over every dent and rock in the road. Felix and Klingmann found seats inside the coach, as they were the only passengers left. The others had dispersed elsewhere. Suddenly the horses halted in the middle of a street, and the coachman pounded on the cab's top, indicating the two travelers to get out. The streets were empty due to the hard rain. Klingmann yelled to the coachman, Would you be so kind to take us to stay somewhere? That is not my problem. Now get out before I charge you both extra. I have other places to be, he hissed. Felix and Karl grabbed their things and were left to fend for themselves in the cold rain. They searched for the nearest inn, which was a challenge as the lamps glowed dim in the wet weather. After walking a few paces down, some lightning flashed, enabling them to see one. Without hesitation, they entered the inn. The front room was a small sitting room. Old candles gave some light. The building had a cabin-like feel, yet water still fell on them as the rain leaked through the ceiling. It smelled musty as well. Felix asked Karl between chattering teeth, "Should we find a better place? I believe we stay here or risk catching hypothermia. Besides, this is only an entryway. We've not even been inside the actual inn yet." Klingmann tried to lift his spirits. They both walked in. The true distasteful sense of the inn hit their faces like a brick wall. A few people were scattered about in the tavern. They looked from the rough side of town. Every eye veered to the nicely dressed gentleman. Karl whispered to Felix, "I think we came in at the wrong end of the city." Before Felix could answer, a lady walked from behind the bar of the tavern. Her kitchen dress was dark green, with a puke-yellow apron, stained with wine and brandy. Her dirty gold locks looked tangled and sticky. She appeared to be 30 or 40. Her stance became stern upon noticing Felix and Klingmann. She was the innkeeper. "What is it you two would want from here?" She walked rather close to them. Felix stepped back at a pace. This woman had not bathed in a long time, if not ever. He nearly retched at her smell. Karl managed to maintain his stance to answer, "A room for the night, 2 beds. If that does not work, one of us can sleep on a chair or something. We just need to crash." "I have 2 single rooms open." She gestured to them to go up the stairs. Klingmann went first. Before Felix followed, the innkeeper forcefully took his luggage. "I can help you with that, dear sir." Her tone changed to deceiving kindness. Felix didn't want to argue and continued on up the stairs with Karl, who still carried his own luggage. Felix helped him, of course. The stairs creaked and felt unstable. When they got up the stairs, the innkeeper handed Karl a key and pointed him to his door. Karl told Felix, "I am retiring for the night. See you in the morning." He left. Felix then turned to the lady. "I shall take my key as well. Just point to the room and I'll get my stuff. I'll help you get everything in the room." She walked towards a door. "That is not necessary. I can manage." He noticed she rummaged the outer pockets of his bags. He only kept a few things in them, but nothing of value. His money he kept close to him in his coat. The innkeeper ignored his request and unlocked the door herself. She carried his luggage in. He followed to be sure she didn't open anything. Upon setting the bags down, she wistfully turned to him. Her demeanor was deemed unfavorable in Felix's eyes. Her intentions, in the obvious, were ill-mannered. He wanted the keys and for her to leave. "Give me the keys now." She handed him the keys in slowness. Felix snatched them from her hand. After taking the keys, she inquired while stepping close, "I can take your coat for you. It's still drenched from the rain. I can get it dry. Please go. I shall manage my own things. Leave me to rest." He covered his nose with a handkerchief to avoid her horrid stench. She took the gesture in offense, eyeing him in disappointment. She made her leave. Felix made sure to shut and lock the door behind her. He then turned back to the room. The first glance deemed it not the nicest. Rather dirty. Disgusting. It was better than catching hypothermia, but after being in the room a while, he began to debate what would be worse. The wooden floorboards creaked terribly as they were worn and chipped. As he observed the floor closer, he noticed a few roaches scouting for food. A mouse rushed from under the bed as he sat on it. He took his coat off and laid on top of that, not daring to lift the blankets. He wanted to be as far from the mattress as possible, as who knew what was crawling about in it. Felix was hesitant to blow out the candle, but he needed to try to sleep. As soon as the room was completely darkened, it became full of the unsettling sounds of the scratching and chewing of rodents. After a bit, he ignored all second thoughts and fell asleep. Felix stirred awake as the sun had risen above the skyline, letting light stream into the room. Upon opening his eyes, and seeing everything in natural light, he wanted to barf. The wood wall panels had water damage and mildew. The ceilings fared the same. He sat up a bit, but froze. A mouse was sitting on him, chewing at his silk waistcoat. He brushed it off and looked at the silk in frustration. It wasn't torn, but it had been frayed. He put on his overcoat, which hid the tattered silk. After grabbing his luggage, he exited the room eagerly. There he met with Klingmann, who was closing the door to his room. He didn't appear at all happy as he incessantly scratched his head. Karl looked to Felix. "That innkeeper is not getting a cent. We need to find some clean water or a lake. I need a bath. I think that bed gave me lice." "A mouse tried to eat me." Felix showed him the chewed silk. They both headed down the stairs. The tavern was empty, so Felix and Karl snuck towards the door. As Karl reached for the handle, someone stopped them both by yanking the backs of their coats. They turned around to see the innkeeper standing in anger. She hissed, "Were you two about to walk out without paying?" "Yeah," Karl bluntly admitted. "This disgusting place gave me head lice." "A mouse ruined my clothes," Felix snapped. The lady rolled her eyes. She sternly said, "Either you pay, or you both will be staying here a week to work here." "You can't make us stay," Karl hissed, opening the door to leave otherwise. Felix followed, but the innkeeper pulled him back. "One of you will at least be staying." Karl instantly turned back and pried Felix from her grip. When she let go, the two of them dashed out of the inn. They felt much relief after jogging a few blocks away. A man driving a chaise rode by, and Karl called to it. The coachman stopped to let them on. Karl asked him, "Do you know of any place to find clean water?" "There is a nice brook on the outskirts of town. The water is crystal clear." Karl and Felix climbed onto the chaise. The coachman drove on. Once they got to the brook, they felt happy to find clean water. Once they cleaned up, the day fared much better. They then found another carriage headed to Edinburgh, the main city of Scotland. The scenery on the way had the beauty they hoped for, riding through the gorgeous mountain views of Arthur's Seat. Felix, of course, sketched much of the land. Upon arriving in Edinburgh early in the day, they were not slow to start sightseeing. The city had charm and calmness. Soon after finding a decent inn, clean and well-maintained, they headed to the Palace of Holyrood House. The palace was a sight to see, with its beautiful castle structure, giving homage to the past monarchy of the land. It gave much essence of the medieval days. The gardens were well planted and blossomed with many sorts of flowers. The air smelled divine, and would please any king or queen that opened their window. A servant escorted Felix and Klingmann inside to give them a tour. The decor gave much insight of the palace's history. Some rooms were fashioned in the medieval style, as such in the days of the palace's most known monarch, Queen Mary. The dining hall had more of a modern touch, but it still gave the impression that the table was suited only for kings, queens, dukes, and duchesses. As they went through the large structure, they stopped near a winding staircase, leading to a room. The servant explained a darker side of the palace's history. Up there is where David Rizzo was found with Queen Mary. He was a court musician, but later became a private secretary of the Queen. He was murdered out of jealousy, as he had influence on Mary. 3 rooms down over there was where he was stabbed 57 times. He pointed to it. Felix went up the winding steps and opened the door. The little room it led to gave a chilling sense. If the room could speak, it would have much to say from what happened all those years ago. Felix then went to check out the other rooms the servant spoke of. It was a few paces away from the staircase. He opened the door to a dim room, a far corner rendered dark and full of mystery. Felix gazed at the room so full of history. His uneasy thoughts became interrupted as someone grabbed him at the shoulders. "Bah!" "Karl!" Felix jumped in pure fright. He turned around to face Klingmann, who stood behind him, giggling. Karl noticed Felix didn't enjoy such a scare and tried to cheer him. "Oh, I'm just having a bit of fun. You're in such deep thought, I couldn't help myself." "Well, you shouldn't joke around here. This was somebody's place of murder." Felix pointed out the obvious. Karl nodded, taking his advice. After observing the room a bit longer, they headed back to the main entrance of the palace. They next took a hike through the yard to see the old chapel where the Queen of Scots had been crowned all so long ago. Felix envisioned a beautiful Gothic cathedral with high walls, an elegant throne, and crafted tapestries. Upon arriving, Felix's imagination rotted. There was a plot of land containing tall grass and some trees. As they walked further, they found a tall, crumpled-up structure of brick and iron fencing. A large slab of rock that appeared to be a chair sat worn and eroded. Ivy crept up the crumbling brick wall of a once beautiful chapel. Upon standing in the middle of the open structure, Felix gazed up at the large exposed window, holding only a few bits of the iron frame showing its design. The sky gave a sudden gloom, saddening the chapel's state. The scene sparked his hearing mind. A sound of longing and reminiscing captured the structure and the fields of green flowing grass surrounding it. The chords were heartfelt with beauty, but the inner depths of the sound were an empty void, begging the question, why? Why had such a beautiful thing been resorted to rubble? They stayed at the ruins a while before heading back to the main palace. While on their way back, Felix grabbed some writing paper and penned a letter for home. My dear family, in the twilight we went to the palace where Queen Mary lived and loved. A little room is shown there, with a swirling staircase leading up to the door. Up this way they came and found Rizzo in that little room, pulled him out, and 3 rooms off there was a dark corner where they murdered him. The chapel close to it is now roofless, grass and ivy grow there, and at that broken altar, Mary was crowned Queen of Scotland. Everything around is broken and mouldering, and the bright sky shines in, I believe in that old chapel, the beginning of my Scottish Symphony. Felix. To the south of Edinburgh, with a day's worth more of beautiful scenes, was the home of the writer Sir Walter Scott. Both Felix and Karl had high hopes to meet the well-acclaimed poet. Felix's reasoning alluded to the fact that lots of Scott's work was used in leads of various composers. Klingmann, as a poet himself, couldn't wait to get some insight from a well-off writer. There was no guarantee that they would meet Sir Scott, as it was possible he wouldn't be home. They arrived at Abbotsford House, having left Edinburgh at the 6th hour. It took 6 tiring hours to get there. Like so many grandiose structures in Scotland, the large home was a castle, standing as if it were watching over a kingdom of its own. The carriage strolled closer to the house on the long driveway. The well-trimmed acres of yard growing green in the sun gave such openness. When they disembarked the carriage, a servant watching for guests stepped out to greet them. They were allowed to enter and take a tour, as was the standard custom with manor houses. The main living quarters where Sir Scott resided was a private section of the house. Felix and Karl were the only visitors at the moment, and it happened to be that Sir Scott was home. Karl asked their guide kindly, "May it be possible to greet Sir Scott? We are both writers of sorts." "I shall see if he's in any mood for a greeting. It is a rare thing for him to be unless he knows you." The servant headed for a staircase. Felix and Karl waited and continued looking at the house. The fireplaces gave much-needed comfort from the windy weather outside. Books were neatly placed on shelves, as well as stacks of books piled on desks and tables. Not as neat. Small statues and decor scattered on other surfaces and above the fireplaces. The servant came back to them with a negative shake of the head at their request. Scott wasn't in the mood for visitors. Felix and Karl sighed in disappointment. They had driven so far. Felix tried to convince the servant. "We have traveled all the way here to meet him. Is he still sleeping? It's noon." Just as he stated the fact, Sir Scott walked into the main room. Felix and Karl turned to him, staring at him like fools. Walter was in the act of gathering his hat and frock coat to leave Abbotsford. Yet upon seeing the expression of the young gentleman visiting, he suddenly paused and spoke sparingly to them. It lasted a mere half-hour of unconventional conversation, not much of poetry or insight. With that, Walter bid his farewells and left the home. Felix and Karl continued through the manor house, observing some poems and books on display, all in disappointment of the waste in traveling 80 miles. Karl wrote of it in a sarcastic way of being a success. July 31st, 1829. Most astonished friends, oh, most amazed readers. Under us the great man is snoring. His dogs are asleep, and his armored knights awake. It is 12 o'clock. I lay quiet on the sofa when someone rushed into the room. Thinking of only Felix, I made some scurrilous remark. That moment I discerned an elderly man. "Oh, Sir Walter," cried I, jumping up. With apologizing blushes, Walter replied, "I have much pleasure in meeting you. Your friend has already beautifully told me what and how much you will write, and may have already written." Meanwhile, hands were shaken, and we were all proceeded in happy ecstasy to Abbotsford. P.S. By Felix. This is all Klingmann's invention. We found Sir Walter Scott in the end of leaving Abbotsford, stared at him like fools, drove 80 miles and lost a day for the sake of the best 1/2 hour of superficial conversation. Melrose confiscated us but little. We were out of humor with great men, with ourselves, with the world, with everything. It was a bad day. The following day they continued their Scottish tour by taking a boat from Edinburgh to the Highlands. Felix wasn't too thrilled about facing the sea, but Karl assured him that it was the quickest route. The water fared calm, so the voyage wasn't as bad as Felix anticipated. His little bit of nausea he managed to distract by opening his sketchbook. After being in the boat a deal of the day and docking, they found stay in the city of Perth. It was beautiful, sitting beside the bank of the river. They found a well-maintained inn. The streets and buildings were decent and clean through the city. There was a fairly new art gallery. It was built only 5 years prior. Felix had much excitement to go see it. He liked any sort of masterworks of various artists. All day in Perth he spent roaming the halls and rooms containing fine art. The oils on canvas, the pencil sketches, and sculptures captured beauty. Klingmann strolled with Felix a while, but wanted to see other parts of the city, so he left to do his own thing for a few hours. When Felix finally left the art gallery for the evening, he met Karl back at the inn. There was a fine restaurant next to their place of stay. Karl suggested, "Why don't we get something a bit fancy tonight? I'm a bit tired of the tavern food." "Yeah, we haven't splurged our money on food. I guess this is the city to do it in," Felix answered. They walked over to the restaurant and got a table near a window, looking out into the river. It was pretty as the evening sun sparkled over it. Felix began speaking to Karl much about some music he planned to write. That ruined chapel had struck his muse so much. As they spoke, a man walked up to their table. He was carrying a large satchel, holding canvases and painting supplies. The man asked Felix, "My good sir, I couldn't help but overhear you speak of music. Your character made me wonder, are you that Mr. Mendelssohn by chance?" "Why, yeah," Felix smiled. The man introduced himself. "My name is James, or Mr. Childs. I've heard much of you from the London papers. I'm a painter and do portraits. I've done a few prolific authors and actors. I would like to make a painting of you. I've got some watercolors with me." That would be nice to have a portrait done in Scotland. Felix thought about it. James turned to Klingmann. "I don't want to leave you out on an offer as well." "Nah, I'm not keen on my looks much. I've had a sketch done recently," Karl declined. Felix assured him, "You don't look bad. Wilhelm's sketch did you justice and goodness. Anyways, I'll sit in for a portrait, but only if you join my friend and I in the tavern at the inn for some good Scottish beer." "Of course," James happily replied. "There is a bright room with windows right over there. The light is perfect for a portrait." He pointed to it. Felix and Karl paid their dinner bill, then followed James to the beautiful open room. It was a place to stand about and drink champagne. James set up his canvas and watercolors. He began sketching Felix as he stood near a wall holding his hat. Felix made sure to pose in style. After finishing the painting, he gave it to Felix to inspect. He approved of it. The three of them then walked back to the inn for some beer. As they drank and chatted, Felix suggested, "Why don't we play chess or something?" "I'm game," James said. Karl stood up. "I'll get my chess set." Karl jumped up the stairs in excitement to get to his room. The other people in the tavern looked at him as if he were mad. Felix and James laughed. After a few rounds of drinks and chess, the hour struck late, indicating time for sleep. Felix and Karl were leaving for the next destination in the morning, so any rest in a good inn was needed. The city of Perth, though, was one of the best stops. The next day, as the open carriage reached the outskirts of the city, the countryside was beautiful. Felix began drawing incessantly. They arrived at Dunkeld, which occupied much of his art. The flowing rivers rushing across the rocks were refreshing upon visiting Rubbling Bridge and Hermitage. It was all a sight to the eyes. Such things were what they had come to the Highlands for. The weather fared well upon hiking and riding through the lands. They had to walk a great deal to see certain things they wanted, but it was worth the while. The next place of stay they came to was quite of interest. A tall white castle, estate-like, set in the midst of the mint-green grass which flowed with the breeze. Purple thistles scattered about here and there. The sky was a pasty bright grey, ready for a sprinkle. The carriage carried on towards the estate. The dark dirt path had old grey stone lining the sides of it. The building was Blair Athol. It was the ancestral home of Clan Murray. Felix and Klingmann were excited to be staying in such a place. As they came to the front of the home, a few people were scattered about. Some of the men, who were local, wore traditional clan uniforms, complete with kilts specific to Clan Murray. The ladies wore typical dresses, having the plaid pattern of the clan. Felix was excited upon seeing a man holding a bagpipe. He had not heard one yet in his time there. The man with the instrument began playing. At first, Felix and Klingmann were intrigued to hear the traditional calls of Scotland. After a few minutes, Felix began to hold his ears in annoyance. The man kept playing and playing. Klingmann didn't seem too bothered, yet. Felix inclined to Karl to head inside. Still upon entering the grand main room, the bagpipes flared with full force. Felix asked a lady that seemed to reside there, "How long does that man play?" "About half an hour, thrice a day, the 8th hour, noon, and the 18th hour. If it is raining outside, he plays here in the main hall. He keeps track of the hours." She then walked away. Felix looked at Karl. "We'll be staying here a night. I don't think I'll be able to handle 2. "Oh, Felix, it's not that bad. It's beautiful, traditional music. Maybe you'll grow accustomed to it in a day." Klingmann tried to cheer him up. They were then shown to their rooms. The guests' rooms were quite large and elegant. Felix set his luggage in the room, in which had a window facing the clear open grassland. Bagpipes were still blaring, so Felix decided to visit Karl's room. His room was much more quiet, and he was relaxing from the carriage ride. Felix sat in a chair across the room, and they spoke. Karl felt at home in Blair Athol. He enjoyed the history and its traditions. As Felix listened to his friend's enthusiasm, he opened his sketchbook and began drawing the room. He drew Klingmann as well and titled the drawing, "The Fair Maid of Perth." After finishing the comical drawing, he showed it to Klingmann. He burst into some laughter. Felix smiled, then finished up some details. The sound of the bagpipes thankfully halted as time for dinner came. The food of Scotland was filling and hearty. The next day was only cloudy, so they decided to visit the falls of Bruar and Monass. They were both beautiful bodies of falling water surrounded by forests. The paths gave much means for hiking and admiring the landscapes. As Felix drew the land often, Klingmann inclined. "You have been sketching so much, and I have not contributed to any sort of art yet on our journey. What if every time you stop to sketch, I make a poem for every place you begin to draw?" "That would be quite fun." Felix grabbed his pencil already, drawing the trees as they rode past them. There was something about trees that felt so natural to pen. The winding trunks were like an automatic starting point on the paper. When lush leaves appeared on the page, Klingmann took in his surroundings and began writing up some rhymes and depicting the fine air of Scotland. They both created much throughout the day, enjoying every bit of it. It carried on at many nature sites as Felix couldn't hold back from his book. Felix assured Klingmann that he'd use his poetry for future leisure. The adventure took up the day until dinner and bed. The next morning, Felix woke to the ear-piercing pipes. It forced him out of bed. Usually he was up earlier, but he was tired. The music sounded louder than yesterday. The band playing was obviously in the main hall, which meant it was raining out. Felix looked out the window to see a developing downpour. He gave a sigh, knowing Karl and he would be staying at least another night if the rain kept up. At least the castle had much to look at in its charm. As Felix still relaxed in bed, he grabbed some letter paper and wrote to home. August 3rd, 1829. This is a most dismal, melancholy, rainy day, but we make shift the best we can, which is indeed not saying much. Earth and sky are wet, though, and whole regiments of clouds are marching up. Yesterday was a lovely day. We passed from rock to rock, many waterfalls, beautiful valleys and rivers, dark wood and heath with red heather in blossom. In the morning we drove an open carriage and walked 21 English miles. I sketched a great deal, and Klingmann hit upon the divine idea, which I am sure will give you great pleasure, of writing some rhymes of every spot of which I make a sketch. Yesterday and today we have been carrying out the plan, which answers charmingly. He has already composed very pretty things. Felix. There was a break in the rain by early afternoon, so Karl and Felix made their leave of Blair Athol. Yet the fun continued in a light horse-drawn cart, riding through mud and the misty air. Another storm was nearing, forcing them to stay the night at Tummel Bridge. They found an inn near the bridge in the nick of time as wind and rain rushed over them. It was humble, made of wood. After they occupied a guest room, the storm outside strengthened. Karl and Felix sat in some chairs near the fireplace in their room. It was large, with 2 nice beds, decorated with crimson curtains. Yet the room was rather empty, other than the beds to sleep. Karl and Felix sat quietly in the dark evening, keeping dry as the wall collected droplets of water. Felix poked at the fire every so often to flare it up. The wind howled and whistled. Doors banged and the window shutters burst open in the affair. The sound of water echoed from the nearby stream and the pouring sky. The floor of the room was made of thin boards of wood in which a conversation penetrated through the servants' room below. They were singing drunken songs and laughing. Somewhere in the house dogs were barking. Instead of some soft English slippers to keep their feet warm, they were giving Scottish shoes made of leather and wood to wear through the house, as not a servant offered any food in the midst of their drinking. Felix went down to the wooden winding staircase to head for the kitchen. A servant girl leaned at the bottom of the staircase, holding a bottle of whiskey. She tried to offer Felix a glass, but he was rather too hungry. Many were at the inn wandering. The young boys wore kilts, running about in play, as the older ones stood, speaking to one another in the native Gaelic. Though Felix was linguistically inclined, he couldn't make out their speech. Though the house had much commotion, he felt a bit lonely, as the culture was so far different that he didn't know what to make of it. Felix found the door to the kitchen. As he was about to go in, a waiter was coming out and asked him, "Is there something you need?" "My friend and I would like some tea and something to eat." "There's freshly brewed chamomile with honey and potato cakes have been made as well. I'll get a tray for you to take." The waiter turned around and was gone for a bit. He came back with a full platter of tea and cakes for 2. Felix thanked him, then took it upstairs. The bit of food filled them for the night. The weather finally seemed to calm for the next day. They gathered their belongings outside the inn next to the horse cart. Once they got to the horse fastened to pull the cart, they drove through the wide country. The vast land was filled with dark green foliage and deep blue bodies of water. The depths of the color gave a lonely mood. The cart took them to Fort Williams, which flourished with history. It was a busy town, as it was a popular destination for those looking for historical sites. Much of the history came from the 18th century during the Jacobite uprisings. Felix and Karl stayed in the town a night before taking a steamer down to Loch Lynne, headed for Oban. Oban was a town by the sea. After arriving in the late afternoon, Felix inclined to venture up a hill at the north part of town. There he saw the Donal Castle. Behind that, the island of Mull and peninsula of Movern were visible. He sketched the charming scenery. "Felix," Karl called from afar, "the ferry for Tobermory leaves soon." "All right, just a minute." Felix smudged the tree's detail, creating depth to his drawing. He cast shadow on the high rocks with his pencil, adding shade. After getting the important aspects of the scene, he walked back down the hill. The ferry to Tobermory wasn't terrible, and when the steamer anchored at the harbour, it was bustling with the young people of the town. The Atlantic Ocean rendered quite a sight with much water. Klingmann was intrigued by its vastness. They found a respectable private house to take room. Everything was well so far in their time journeying the Hebrides. Though Felix's feelings of the sea were a negative means of travel, something about the ferry that took him from Oban to Tobermory struck his hearing mind. When they settled in the nice home to stay, he went to the writing desk and began penning what fueled his muse. It was a beginning sketch of a distinctive motif that moved down. It repeatedly played over and over in his head. Each time he heard it, something more added to the motif. One part that stuck out was a single note from the flute's starting simple. They then rose, giving the illusion of anticipation. After completing a few bars, he decided to write back home, as he had not written much to his family in his time in the Highlands. He neatly noted, August 7th, 1829. In order to make understandable how extraordinarily the Hebrides affected me, the following occurred to me. Felix. Karl and Felix made plans for what they wanted to do the next day. They had heard much about the islands of Staffa and Iona. There was an ancient cave called Fingal that was a must-see sight. Yet to get there, they would have to leave early the next morning on a ferry, and the sea tended to be rough in that area. They were warned that the weather would not be the most calm. Karl told Felix upon the information, "We don't have to go to the islands and cave if you don't want to. I don't want all of this seasickness ruining the trip for you." "I really do want to see the cave. I have much anticipation to go. I can manage." Felix felt determined, as the previous few times at sea finally seemed to not bother him as much. Yet he rather wasn't thinking on the fact that the past 2 boat rides rode on near still water. The next morning, at the 5th hour, Felix and Karl were at the harbour, waiting for the ferry. It was dark out, but the lamps lit the area. The waves rumbled about in the darkened ocean. Felix stared at it, not knowing if he could bear boarding a boat. It was rather late to change their plans, as their passes were purchased, and the ferry was docking. The sailor struggled a bit to dock the boat, but managed. A group of passengers eagerly boarded. Felix felt queasy looking at the unstable ferry. He silently refused to step on, holding up the line until Karl nudged him from behind. August 10th, 1829. For that the Atlantic did, it stretched out its 1,000 feelers more and more roughly, twirling us about like anything. The ship household kept its breakfast almost for itself, few people on board being able to manage their cups and saucers. Ladies as a rule fell down like flies, and one or the other gentlemen followed their example. I only wish my fellow sufferer had not been among them, but he is on better terms with the sea as a musician than as an individual or a stomach. Klingmann was sitting at the mess of the scene in which was the deck of the ferry, writing with such experience. Felix sat violently ill of the raging sea, having thrown up every bit of food he'd eaten. It rendered him to pointlessly gagging. Karl was not the sort to be bothered by water, but even this ride was unsettling. He still managed to keep his breakfast down. 2 daughters and a mother sat on the deck as well. The mother was not suited for the sea, and the arrogant girls could have cared less. They sat quietly in annoyance at the cold air and disgusted by the sickened passengers. At the same time, a man entertained himself and a few others by playing a tambourine whilst whistling the familiar huntsman chorus from Weber's opera. Next to Karl, an old woman sat, nudging and irritating him. She wanted to be sure to see the island of Staffa, and pushed Karl to be sure to get a clear view of it. Karl was rather trapped between the nagging old lady, taking her bothersome shoves, and Felix, who consistently leaned onto him during fits after fainting out of illness. Thankfully, they neared Staffa. There was by no means of the ferry to dock, so it anchored a ways out. The passengers wanting to visit the island boarded some smaller boats to reach the basalt pillars of the land. Every moment of this trip for Felix was a torture, as the boat floated with the swelling body of water. Once they got on to some land, which was the stumps of the pillar rocks, they ventured towards Fingal's cave. In Karl's eyes, the shapely walls of the cavern looked like endless pipes of an immense organ, black and resounding, and absolutely without purpose, and quite alone with the wide grey sea, within and without. As the seawater crashed against the rocks, the old woman who had been a bother to Karl pushed her way through the group to see the cave of Staffa. She wanted to see it as her age was advanced, numbering her experiences of extraordinary sights. Felix gazed upon the swelling abyss of waves. He began to hear the crescendo of the winds and strings from the piece he noted the night before. The movement of the waves consumed his daze as he unconsciously leaned closer to look down. Something had struck his curiosity about the deepness. He stepped onto one of the pillar rocks at the edge. Yet his tolerance for turbulent seas got the best of him. Karl noticed his dizzy state and pulled him away from standing too close to it. Felix snapped out of his doze. Feeling a rush of adrenaline, Karl suggested to his friend, "Why don't you sketch the cave? It might lift your spirits." "I'm not much in a mood to sketch such ill-fated water," Felix groaned. Karl sighed, wishing for his friend to have a better time at this unique destination. The cave was admired a while longer before exiting back to the little boats. When they boarded them, Karl noticed something on the high cliffs. They were cute little birds nestled on the side. They looked like adorable little penguins. He pointed them out. "Hey look, puffins. They're so cute." Felix instantly admired them. It was something unexpected to see and quite extraordinary. The birds ended up being the only brightening thing to lift his mood. It lasted only a short while. The boat left the island, and the unpleasant smell of the steamer filled everyone's noses upon arriving back to it. The water rocked everything more so this time. No one boarded without at least slightly feeling unwell. Klingmann watched the two arrogant daughters' delicate faces run pale. The old woman trembled as the boat moved up and down. She boarded the steamer with some difficulty. No one spoke as the ferry moved on through the Atlantic. The man that had tapped at the tambourine and whistled remained somewhere below deck. The scent of stale ham lingered in the air as the cook decided to fire such. Many complaints were aimed at the captain. In return, the captain agreed to take a shortcut back to Oban by way of stopping in Iona. The stop at that island was well worth the rest and beauty. There were ruins of an old cathedral, remains of a convent, and graves of ancient Scottish kings. A sense of loneliness flowed throughout Iona. The illness of the sea seemed to disappear all at once after Iona. Even Felix felt well fared. Yet as everything could not be perfect, irritability replaced seasickness. A light rain drizzled. Felix sighed, managing to look out into the sea. "I wish the rain would stop." "It's more of a mist," Klingmann corrected. "It's raining," Felix corrected back. They bickered about the simple act of the weather. They then knew they needed a break from each other after spending so much time crammed in a boat or a carriage in the past week or so. As they expected to be back in Oban by the 7th hour, they had only reached Tobermory. As everyone was tired and worn, the captain anchored the ferry off to the side a few paces from the harbor. Few had the wakefulness, the arrogant travelers, to take a boat to the shore. Felix and Karl were too exhausted to follow that idea. The ferry had a cabin, but no beds. Everyone in the tired state resorted to sleeping on the floor. There were few blankets and pillows given, but many used their frocks to keep warm and boots to rest their heads. Felix and Karl found a corner, close to the steamer's engine. Some warmth from the steam heated the wall there. Felix laid his coat down and huddled, trying to get to every bit of warmth. Karl sat beside him, leaning against the wall to get some shut-eye. They were content at first, until others in the crowding room sought it as a good resting place as well. It became quite claustrophobic around them. Unconventionally, the travelers that stayed on the boat were dusty, smelly sailors and Highlanders. Karl later wrote of it, August 1829. "At times when half asleep, I tried to drive the flies from my face, and then found they were the grisly locks of an old Scotsman." After making it back to Oban and leaving the town, they went to the city of Glasgow. There they visited a cotton mill, which was a relatively new and flourishing business. The noise of the mill sounded like that of the Falls of Moness. The manner of it all made time in the Highlands move at an alarming pace. Felix felt he needed to write back to home, but so much had happened. He still had the paper of his musical sketch of the Hebrides. He added to the letter, "How much lies betwixt my last letter and this? The most fearful sickness, staffa, scenery, travels, people. Klingmann has described it all, and you will excuse a short note. The more so, as what I can best tell you is contained in the above music. After Glasgow, they travelled a ways north to see some of the famous lochs, such as Ben Lomond, Loch Katrine, and Loch Lomond. Felix once again continued his sketching that had been halted from his previous ill feelings at Staffa. He drew a landscape of the reeds and greenery. Karl watched him draw and sighed. Would it not be a dream to live in such a scene? I would very much like a splendid cottage over there. If I ever fell in love someday, my wife would be outside reading away and I would be composing and drawing the scene from afar. Felix began doodling in a garden-like cottage with the figure of a girl in a fine dress and bonnet. A servant held some refreshments. The imagery reminded Felix of the poem, The Lady of the Lake, by that disappointing Sir Scott. They took a rowboat to cross the loch, as there appeared to be a light from a real house there. As they were in the middle of the loch, they had to row harder as a sudden wind swept through. The boat seesawed fearfully. Their stuff was thrown about, making a mess. Klingmann became anxious as everything went topsy-turvy. Felix braced himself, ready to jump out and swim if needed. It was strange, as he was such a fantastic swimmer in the water, but couldn't handle movement whilst floating on it. Thankfully, they made it to the safety of the other shore. There they found a small house where other travelers were taking a rest. It consisted of a larger main room with some chairs and 2 guest rooms. The owner was a man that lived on the basics and welcomed anyone to stay. Felix and Karl got their luggage, reorganized in the main room. An irritable young Englishman sat cursing to himself of his companions. He did not care for such wilderness. Outside the house, a group was cooking dinner, a few paces away amongst the forest. Felix and Karl wanted to check it out, and gladly the food was shared with them. It was quite a little experience. The next day, though, the rain poured again. Their Highland adventure was nearing the end, in the way of the weather and bleakness. They returned to Glasgow to take room. There they penned letter and diary entries of their trip through Scotland. Klingmann penned, poetically reminiscing, August 15th, 1829. Ever memorable country, the Highland smell will be remembered by us, a certain smoky atmosphere which every Highlander has about him. I once, while going along, closed my eyes and then correctly stated that 5 Highlanders had passed by, for my nose had seen them. At last we issued from the Highlands, longing for the warm sun, which we had not seen for days, and we might have become Highland sick and wished ourselves back had we not known the reality within the mountain land was grey and cold and majestic. It was a sweet farewell to the heights which we at once abuse and love. Karl Klingmann. Felix's letter had a different way of recalling his experience in the country. He nearly forgot that the hustle and bustle of London was contained in this entire area called Britain. He wrote, "This, then, is the end of our Highland journey, and the last of our joint letters. We've been happy together, roaming the country as gaily as if storms and rain had not existed, but they did exist. To describe the wretchedness and the comfortless, indispensable solitude of the country, time and space do not allow. Whiskey is the only drink. There is no churches, no streets or gardens. Many huts have no roof and crumbling walls, and many houses have been destroyed by fire. It is no wonder the Highlands have been called melancholy, but we have been happy enough, laughing, rhyming, sketching, growling at each other and the world, eating anything edible and sleeping for 12 hours every night. We won't forget it as long as we live. Felix Mendelssohn."